gilded cage of the medieval court, life was not lived openly. Every glance, every shared laugh, every carefully scented breath carried a potential charge. This world, draped in velvet and illuminated by sputtering tallow, was less a center of culture than it was an intricate spiderweb spun from ambition, suspicion, and lethal perfume. The feast was a spectacle of excess. Towers of exotic fruit dominated the trestle tables, and the air hung heavy with competing aromas. Sandalwood mixed with musk, spilled wine mingling with the sharp bite of imported spices. It smelled overwhelmingly rich, the very essence of opulence. Yet, amidst this suffocating cloud of luxury, there was always that subtle discordance. The initial suspicion never fell upon a dagger or an outright confrontation. It began much more subtly, inhaled into the delicate membranes of perception. It started with the scent of the wine, while the deep red liquid flowed easily from silver ewer to gilded cup. One particular note, a faint metallic sweetness beneath the established aromas, caught the attention of those paying too much heed. The court expected an intoxicating bouquet, ripe berries, sweet earth, perhaps a hint of rare floral liqueur. But this scent was sharper, more meticulously engineered. It spoke of chemistry rather than harvest. It possessed the unsettling perfection of something manufactured for effect. This realization acted like a needle point dropped into a stagnant pond, sending out slow, concentric ripples of unease. The danger, it became clear, lay not just in the liquid itself, but in everything surrounding its preparation and presentation. The perfumers, the spice merchants, even the bakers who kneaded bread using exotic imported grounds, each station represented a possible vector for silent sabotage. Paranoia was not a mental weakness, it was an acute survival mechanism, honed by centuries of courtly brutality. The investigation, conducted in hushed corners away from the main feast hall's glare, focused on the innocuous objects, the scented candles meant to mask odors, the spice racks filled with spices whose origin could never be definitively traced, and most vulnerable, the fresh loaves of bread. These items were meant to sustain life, yet they became potential instruments of death. The very act of scenting a room, whether through perfume or incense, was seen as an attempt to chemically control the narrative, literally masking the telltale signs of decay or contamination. The whispers accompanying these initial observations were devastatingly polite. They did not accuse of murder, they questioned craftsmanship. Was this spice from the reliable southern trade route, or a more questionable, newly opened source? Did this perfume contain an adulterant that would react poorly with certain known medicinal herbs? The poison, in its most refined form, was always framed as an accidental mistake, a tainted batch, an improperly stored spice jar, an ill-advised new blend of oils. The gravity of the situation demanded an almost scientific level of observation. One had to learn to differentiate between natural human imperfection, a slight liver complaint, the exhaustion from too much gaiety, and something acutely foreign, something chemically dissonant. The connoisseurs of courtly intrigue were not merely taste makers. They were forensic chemists operating with nothing but expensive manners and finely tuned suspicions. The realization settled over the attendees that true threat did not require grand, dramatic gestures. It thrived in the mundane routine, a dinner service, the preparation of morning breath, the mixing of seasonal drinks. A poisoned candle could be mistaken for one simply losing its wax. An altered spice blend might just taste stronger than usual. The art was to make suspicion look like simple intellectual curiosity. The atmosphere, initially charged with festive anticipation, slowly curdled into something tense and hypervigilant. Conversation became coded. Eyes tracked not the faces of rivals, but the hands that passed things, the passing bread knife, the refill pitcher, the scented cushion placed upon a throne's armrest. Every exchange was layered with a potential hidden meaning. Every touch felt invasive. The danger presented by these early suspicions forced the nobility to retreat into an exaggerated pretense of normalcy. They laughed too loudly at bad jokes. They complimented foreign garments with painstaking detail. They ate banquets designed not for nourishment, but as highly scrutinized theaters of deception. To appear perfectly innocent, one had to be absolutely flawless in every minute gesture. This initial stage established the most terrifying principle of courtly life. Suspicion itself was a form of poison. It did not need a vial or a clandestine administration. It simply required enough people to believe it. Once the seeds of doubt were planted, a whisper about the wine's strange aroma, a subtle critique of the candle's smoke, the ensuing investigation quickly consumed all reason and trust. The stage was set for an enemy far more formidable than any invading army. The collective, malicious judgment of one's own peers. And in this world, where beauty and opulence masked deep-seated malice, the deadliest weapon remained exactly what seemed most fragile. A carefully curated piece of scented smoke. The splendor of the court was a fragile glass house, beautiful, but perpetually on the verge of shattering. Survival here demanded more than political wit. It required an almost sinister understanding of the human body itself. We had learned that suspicion could be seeded by the scent of spice or the glaze of expensive wine, making every shared meal a dangerous charade. But sometimes the threat was not something passed through the cup, but something internalized, a failing organ, a sudden cough, a fever that gripped without warning. As our characters navigated the gilded cages of high society, they began to encounter a new kind of vulnerability, illness. In this world, the falling sick room became a stage as potent and treacherous as the grand ballroom. A nobleman collapsing mid-conversation was not simply misfortune, it was an opportunity. It was a weapon. The medical arts themselves were part of the conspiracy. The court physician, highly esteemed by title, but often wildly unreliable in practice, possessed knowledge that was both academic and fatally subjective. He could attribute symptoms to bad humors, to an imbalance of the four elements, or perhaps to vapors, a grandly vague dismissal that allowed accusations to float freely without needing concrete proof. If you were ill, your suffering became fodder for political discussion, a volatile piece of emotional evidence. The subtle power play lay in the diagnosis itself. Was this genuine frailty brought on by age, or was it something far more insidious? Did the sudden paleness stem from poor constitution, or from the slow action of a foreign agent at work? The key conspirators in court were not necessarily poisoners. They were rumor mongers who specialized in medical conjecture. They would observe the slight discoloration of skin, the unusual tremor in a hand, and weave those observations into narratives of decline, narratives that could be politically damning. Consider the vulnerability presented by natural processes. A wasting cough was easily blamed on poor digestion. A sudden lethargy could be excused as travel fatigue. But within the conspiratorial minds of the nobility, these explanations were merely camouflage for suspicion. They began to scrutinize diets with unnerving intensity, paying obsessive attention to what one consumed and when. Was this rival's appetite suddenly erratic? Did they favor certain rare spices in their meals that might interact badly with established medical practices? These observations formed the foundation of deeper paranoia. The most chilling aspect of this chapter was the weaponization of uncertainty. When you could not point to a vial of deadly poison, nor to a visible enemy armed in the street, your accuser needed only to convince the court that something unnatural, was at play. They manufactured an aura of inexplicable malady, a condition that defied easy explanation, and thus required intense, suspicious scrutiny. One could find themselves in deeply charged diagnostic debates. The healer might speak of bile or phlegm, but beneath those flowery pronouncements lay the cold logic of political assassination, a nobleman whose ailments seemed to coincide with a decline in favor, or perhaps with an encroaching alliance of rivals, raised immediate and terrible questions. Were their humors disturbed by natural causes, or by emotional strain induced by political stress? The distinction was impossibly fine. This environment bred medical paranoia. Every headache, every slight stomach upset became a potential smoking gun. Courtiers learned to manage their physical state with surgical precision. They developed elaborate routines of diet and mild tonic consumption, not for health, but for defensive optics. They needed to appear robustly stable, unpredictable enough to seem natural, yet flawlessly resilient to challenge. The subtle difference between natural decay and engineered affliction was the dividing line between a noble life and utter ruin. If the court could be convinced that your suffering stemmed from internal weakness, a flaw in blood or bone structure, you were rendered politically inert, a harmless relic of an older guard. But if they suspected external interference, whispers would ignite into outright conspiracy. The diagnosis thus became a form of preemptive execution. Our protagonists found themselves perpetually observing their rivals' physical routines. They tracked the times they ate, the way their retinue attended to them, and the specific questions asked by the court physicians. Was the dose of laudanum prescribed for sleep genuinely meant for rest? Or was it designed merely to keep a rival incapacitated during crucial negotiations? Every interaction with a healer, every whispered medical opinion, became a piece of intelligence in an invisible, brutal war. The cost of this surveillance was exhausting. The constant performance required of vigorous health, of perfect temper, of impeccable digestion was mentally draining. One could live perpetually under the scrutiny of scalpels and stethoscopes, knowing that while the physical threat had been momentarily averted by the sheer opacity of human deceit, the mental toll remained devastating. It taught them a core, terrifying truth about courtly life. Sometimes the most dangerous assassin was not the one who sought to inflict pain, but the one who merely controlled the narrative around it. To control the diagnosis was to control destiny. And in that gilded sphere of medieval politics, controlling one's own humors was an act of sheer survival against a conspiracy whispered across feverish nights. The ultimate danger in the gilded cage of a medieval court is not the poisoned cup or the hastily administered dose of oblivion. It is something far more insidious, something that requires no physical substance at all: reputation. Before the whisper became an actionable weapon, it was merely conjecture, a passing rumor spoken over a too-full goblet of wine. But in the volatile atmosphere of aristocratic life, where status was breath and favor was currency, pure suggestion hardened into destructive fact. The truth had become irrelevant. Only the narrative held power. We have seen how suspicion can begin with a tainted aroma or a sudden chill of illness, yet the subtler threat is one that operates entirely in the realm of consciousness. To be suspected of treason, not because you plotted an army revolt, but because you laughed too loudly at the wrong jest. To be deemed morally lacking, merely for having connections to disgraced households. These accusations were lethal precisely because they left no residue on a cup or stain on a curtain. They dissolved into thin air, leaving only the irreparable damage to one's social standing. The courtly life taught its participants a cold mastery of linguistics. The art was not poisoning, but accusation, the deployment of well-placed venomous gossip. A whisper, carefully pitched and timed, could be far more potent than any dagger thrust in the dark. It bypassed the body entirely, striking at the very foundation of a person's existence, their perceived goodness, their reliability, their inherent worth to the ruling power. The noble houses, obsessed with lineage and honor, treated reputation as if it were literal physical coinage. To lose one's favor was not merely an inconvenience, it was social death, a swift descent into political irrelevance. One could be stripped of all authority, exiled from courtly circles, and effectively forgotten by the state, simply through the disciplined accumulation of mistrust. Consider the meticulous labor involved in fabricating a downfall purely via rumor. It demands not only malice, but extreme organizational skill. There must be multiple nodes feeding the lie, a careless servant whispering near the stable yard, a rival noble feigning concern, while actually planting a seed of doubt, and an influential court poet framing the whispers into ostensibly harmless verse. Each piece of misinformation acts as a subtle accelerant on a slow-burning pyre. The collective belief in the lie becomes the fire. In these deadly circles, even moments of apparent innocence were potential liabilities. A sudden overindulgence at a feast could be spun into proof of debauchery and weakness. An unexpected visit from an undesirable relative could be framed as evidence of secret correspondence with foreign enemies. Every gesture was scrutinized, every word catalogued, waiting for the moment it could be wrenched out of context and presented as irrefutable proof of deep disloyalty. The paranoia bred by this system cultivated a profound culture of self-censorship among its inhabitants. People learned to police their own speech with terrifying strictness. They mastered the art of non-commitment, offering pleasant platitudes that revealed nothing genuine about their beliefs or loyalties. Silence, too, became an armor, a shield, suggesting either unwavering loyalty or fatal inscrutability. The accusation of disloyalty required little evidence if it was rooted in personal weakness or family history. Was a person's family connected to a rebel group from 3 generations ago? Did their spending habits suggest undue familiarity with merchants from rival kingdoms? These historical threads, regardless of their current relevance or factual basis, were easily rewoven by skilled accusers and presented as undeniable proof of ongoing treasonous sympathy. When physical threats are visible, a poisoned meal, a blade in the dark, they demand immediate countermeasures. You can identify the toxin, trace the delivery method, and even survive the initial blow. But when the threat is purely conceptual, where your life force hinges on the whim of collective belief, resistance is almost impossible. How do you physically fight an accusation? How do you argue against the fundamental truth that perhaps a powerful enough faction simply decides you are unworthy to exist in their sphere? The accuser did not have to be right. They only needed to be convincing. They had to construct a compelling narrative of moral decay, political failure, or deep-seated disloyalty, one that resonated with the established fears and biases of the court. The victims were thus left navigating an unseen battlefield, the psychological terrain of suspicion. Their most valuable commodity was their good name, and rumor made it indistinguishable from smoke, ephemeral, potent, and easily scattered by a strong wind of suggestion. Thus, the true mastery of the medieval court was not in killing with poison, but in starving the target politically. It was about orchestrating an absence, the gradual removal of patronage, the loss of speaking rights at feasts, the deliberate exclusion from key council meetings. These social exiles were more terrifying than death itself, because they represented a slow erasure, the systematic dismantling of a life that relied entirely on the acknowledgement and good graces of others. The whispers taught the courtier to look perpetually over his shoulder, never trusting the sincerity in another's smile, always measuring the true depth of their friend's gaze. It was an exhausting, paranoid existence, a continuous performance where every single human interaction carried the deadly risk of irreparable slander. And that, perhaps, is the most lethal art of all, the mastery of appearing utterly trustworthy while systematically plotting a ruinous whisper against your rival's very soul. The feast was meant to be a celebration of union, a binding diplomatic ritual involving the greatest houses and most powerful minds assembled at one gilded table. Every plate, every fold of velvet, every shimmering crystal goblet spoke of permanence and mutual respect. But within the intoxicating air, under the illusion of shared goodwill, simmered something far more volatile than good wine. Deep, predatory suspicion. We had spent the preceding weeks learning that vulnerability was not merely a state of being at court. It was a commodity to be exploited, an asset to be weaponized. The dinner table itself became the most dangerous confessional booth in all of Christendom. Here, pronouncements were made over shared platters, and compliments often carried the weight of thinly veiled threats. The centerpiece of this evening's tension was liquid, the generous flow of wine meant for toasts, the punch intended to loosen tongues, and the specialized drafts served only when discussing treaties or alliances. Every gesture involving a cup felt heavy with implication. We are forced to look closely at the subtle mechanics of contamination. It is not enough simply to know that poison exists. One must understand its presentation. The most effective poisons do not taste of death, but of enhancement, a slightly sharper edge in the vintage, a sweet counterpoint to the tartness of the wine, something mistakenly labeled as exotic flavoring or rare liqueur. The art of poison diplomacy hinges on two elements, proximity and assumption. Proximity grants access to the physical means. Assumption provides the necessary cover story. The conspirator does not need a grand overture of violence. They merely need enough time near the beverage service, a brief moment with an open decanter or the passing of a cup, while everyone's focus is fixed on the speaker's eloquence. The current web of suspicion was already thick enough to choke a dragon. Our protagonists were keenly aware that mere chemical discordance, the lingering scent of almonds in a spice cabinet, the suspiciously bright sheen of a candied violet, was insufficient for an accusation when power itself was the currency. The accuser needed not just evidence, but plausible deniability and perfect timing. The pressure built with every rising glass. When a cup is passed from hand to hand, it collects residue. It assumes multiple identities. A wine stained by the fingertips of a court physician might be interpreted differently than one touched by the glove of a visiting ambassador. The transference itself becomes suspect evidence. Was the slight discoloration on the inside of the goblet natural sediment? Or was it something carefully applied, dissolving slowly enough to avoid immediate detection, yet potent enough when consumed in combination with other elements? The challenge for those investigating was not merely forensic, it was sociological. Who saw what, and more importantly, who would believe what they saw? An overly cautious suspicion could be dismissed as the paranoia of a desperate outcast. Extreme vigilance could be painted as madness or treasonous jealousy. Observe the patterns of consumption. Notes are taken not on the poisons themselves, for those elements were too varied, too fleeting, but on the recipients and the ritual surrounding them. Who was supposed to toast whom? Whose health had recently been questioned? And crucially, who stood positioned near the service stations when a specific cup was poured or refilled? The dinner table became a stage where every passing conversation served as misdirection. A heated discussion about border tariffs could be a cover for the whispered transfer of minute powders. An admiring praise of a nobleman's wit might mask the deployment of hallucinogenic smoke from an incense burner, subtly altering the emotional state of those nearby. The greatest vulnerability is not the physical act of poisoning, but the perceived helplessness when questioned. If the suspect can convince the court that the contamination was accidental, a servant's oversight, a foreign liquor sample wrongly introduced, then the threat remains theoretical, merely insulting rather than deadly. This required levels of deceit that bordered on performance art. The poison had to be administered in a way that seemed inseparable from genuine courtly merriment. The protagonists navigated this labyrinth by cultivating an air of studied indifference. To appear thoroughly integrated into the luxurious, treacherous routine was survival itself. They mastered the art of looking utterly trustworthy while their minds catalogued every deviation. The tremor in a passing hand, the unusually bright color of a freshly cut ribbon used to adorn a bread basket, the distinct mineral tang beneath the expected floral notes of the celebrated vintage. The entire assembly seemed suspended between conviviality and conspiracy. The polite clinking of silver against crystal only amplified the underlying tension. Every laughter felt brittle. Every shared gaze weighted by unspoken understanding, or perhaps unspoken accusation. We learned that in the rarefied atmosphere of royal diplomacy, suspicion is not a byproduct of power. It is the core mechanism through which power maintains itself, ensuring that even pleasure meals end with a reckoning, served cold and bitter. The poison in the medieval court was rarely a swift draught of hemlock or nightshade. It was subtler, more insidious, a poisoned withdrawal. By this point, we had learned that suspicion followed scent, and reputation could be dismantled by nothing more than a misplaced whisper across a polished dining hall table. We mastered the delicate performance of belonging, navigating feasts, where every gesture felt like an interrogation, and every shared cup carried the potential weight of treason. But true mastery of courtly survival demands more than mere caution. It requires anticipating the sudden vacuum. The most terrifying form of betrayal is not the direct blow, but the absence itself. Our investigation had led us through the treacherous landscape of rumor, showing how quickly a name could be soiled by fabricated whispers, and how vulnerable a life was when fueled only by social favor. We saw that physical poisoning, the tainted bread, the poisoned wine, was predictable, even if complex. It required access, proximity, and the risk of discovery. But what happens when the threat doesn't require a weapon at all? What happens when the deadliest act is simply doing nothing? The power structure of the late medieval court was built upon patronage. Favor was not merely affection, it was oxygen. It was the golden thread linking an ambitious noble, or even a talented scholar, to immunity and influence. To be favored meant you existed within a protected sphere. You could speak freely, argue loudly, and even fail publicly, because your sponsor would absorb the blow. This patronage system created deep-seated dependency, making those who owed favor utterly vulnerable. They were not merely political, they were financially and socially captive. And thus arrived the greatest fear, withdrawal. To lose a patron was to be erased. It was a social death with no fanfare, requiring no visible evidence of malfeasance. The accusation was simply non-existence, the invisible vacuum left by a hand that suddenly refused to reach out. It is an absence treated as definitive proof of guilt. We watched the subtle mechanics of this collapse unfold in real time, focusing on Lady Alara, whose destiny had been inextricably linked to the towering favor enjoyed by Lord Valerius. For years, her brilliance and wit had functioned as a perfect complement to his own immense power. She was shielded, protected by the very glow of his approval. She understood that in this environment, remaining silent and dutifully complimentary was sometimes the only way to survive. Her survival depended entirely on the perception that she remained fully useful, fully asterisk in asterisk. The first signs were almost imperceptible. A delay in a reply, a hesitant nod during a council meeting where his presence used to ensure absolute unanimity. Valerius, once radiating an irresistible aura of protective strength, began to exhibit flickers of distraction. His attention, which had been a commodity traded with breathtaking generosity, started to dissipate. The subtle shift was interpreted by the rival faction, the jealous dukes and countesses, who had long resented Alara's brilliance in the shadow of Valerius's spotlight, not as mere fatigue, but as cold, strategic detachment. They began whispering about her perceived over-reliance on his goodwill, subtly questioning whether her own merit could sustain her when his hand faltered. Then came the pivotal moment, the grand winter ball. It was meant to be a reaffirmation of alliances, a celebratory display of continued power. Alara approached Valerius across the crowded hall, ready with the practiced smile and deferential banter that had kept her relevant for years. She prepared to remind him, subtly and charmingly, of the last significant debt he owed her, a carefully worded reminder that would re-anchor his attention and thus prolong her safety. But something was different. His usual boisterous reception of her presence was muted, where once his laughter had been a booming wave washing away any doubt. Now it felt measured, like the careful ringing of a distant bell. When she spoke, his eyes did not sparkle with the familiar fire. They held a guardedness, an assessment that seemed to quantify her value in real time. The atmosphere changed from one of collective celebration to forensic observation. The courtiers surrounding them were no longer interested in joining the revelry. They stood slightly apart, their postures rigid, like judges awaiting the pronouncement of guilt. They watched Alara and Valerius not as a unit, but as two separate entities engaged in a failing transaction. Whispers, those invisible weapons we had catalogued before, returned with renewed venom. These were no longer rumors about bad morals or ill-gotten spies. They targeted the fundamental principle of her worthiness. Was she necessary? Did she contribute enough to justify his ongoing favor? The conversation, the real one, conducted in the flickers of glances and hushed intakes of breath, was clear. She was becoming a liability. His sustained attention had cost him more than he realized. It had created an expectation that even he found difficult to maintain. The final severing was not dramatic. It was merely procedural. Valerius, cornered by his own failing energies and the undeniable weight of competing demands, military matters drawing his focus, internal political squabbles demanding constant attention, simply ceased allocating the necessary mental bandwidth to Alara's existence. His eyes drifted past her. His answers became brief summaries rather than engaging dialogues. He was performing an act of social divestment. The loss of favor is particularly terrifying because it leaves no physical trace for the investigators to find. There is no residue on a cup, no stain on a tapestry, and no discernible illness in the body. The only evidence is the gaping hole left where warmth once existed. It is the sudden cessation of an essential, invisible current. This vacuum created by Valerius's cooling attention did not merely destabilize Alara. It initiated a domino effect across the entire political landscape. The courtiers, who had previously treated her with polite suspicion, now found themselves in a precarious position. They were accustomed to the rules of engagement. One needed a strong pillar of favor to safely critique or circumvent an opponent. But when that pillar crumbled, the playground became dangerously unstable. The surviving nobles realized they could no longer afford the luxury of openly campaigning against Alara, because doing so would invite immediate backlash from Valerius's increasingly defensive retainers. Furthermore, in a court where ambition is paramount, silence and studied detachment become the most powerful political currency. The safest strategy was to adopt what we call strategic non-acknowledgement. The once vibrant narrative of Alara's brilliance faded into an uncomfortable quietude. Her skills were no longer required. Her presence was viewed as a resource that had depreciated past its usable life. She found herself adrift in the very hall where she had expected to solidify her position. The ultimate lesson learned here is one of brutal psychological economy. Favor is a limited commodity, and when it runs out, not even genius or unparalleled charm can replenish the supply. The cold reality was that surviving court life required not just understanding how others could strike you with poison, with rumors, or with visible slander, but understanding the deep psychological weakness of the system itself, its dependency on constant affirmation. And when the ultimate source of affirmation simply stops validating your existence, all your cleverness and studied indifference are rendered meaningless. You become an orphan of influence, stripped bare by a polite decline into irrelevance, navigating a silent world where the absence of a single nod is worth more than 1,000 damning accusations. Court of kings and queens, a brilliant tapestry woven with threads of gold and betrayal, operates on whispers and glances. But when the venom is too subtle to trace back to a single gilded cup or discarded rumor, suspicion inevitably leads down into the shadows to knowledge that should never be seen by polite society. The previous chapters taught us that the greatest threats were often those woven from air, maligned reputation, withheld favor, and expertly tailored whispers. But desperation has its own source, and when survival hangs in the balance, it becomes necessary to seek methods beyond mere social warfare. The battlefield shifts from the grand ballroom to the grimy stalls of the black market. This is where forbidden knowledge blooms. Not just the obscure texts detailing Roman poison recipes or questionable herbal remedies favored by disgraced apothecaries, but the deeper understanding of how human desire and biological weakness can be exploited with almost scientific precision. Our protagonists must navigate a subterranean world, a realm far removed from the embroidered formality of court life, where true currency is information and forbidden matter. The scent of stale incense mixes with the acrid smell of medicinal chemicals. Here, under sputtering tallow lamps rather than chandelier brilliance, the language changes. The polite concerns about ill humors are replaced by the cold terminology of dosage, efficacy, and administration. What once seemed like mere court gossip now acquires a deadly, practical structure. The knowledge they pursue is inherently dangerous because it demands discretion above all else. It requires access to sources that deal in decay and death, the docks where foreign poisons arrive disguised as trade goods, the hidden libraries of heretical scholars who recorded forgotten arts of slow decline, or the secretive gatherings of smugglers who bring wares from lands untouched by royal law. Here, they learn about preparations far more sophisticated than simple tinctures. They encounter compounds designed not merely to kill outright, but to mimic natural processes, to replicate the pangs of a common fever, the wasting effects of an intestinal blight, or the slow neurological decline that plagues the very wealthy and powerful. The poison is transformed from a crude weapon into a form of highly specialized biological sabotage. Their journey becomes less about detective work in plush drawing rooms and more about deep anthropological investigation into the body itself. They are studying vulnerabilities. How can one attack memory? How can one induce crippling paranoia without leaving any physical trace? The texts they consult detail poisons that interfere with perception, creating hallucinations, or inducing a fatal detachment from reality, the perfect downfall for a character whose power rested upon their perceived wisdom and divine grace. The danger at this juncture is twofold. First, the knowledge itself attracts immense risk. Ownership of such secrets marks one as an outcast, feeding both enemies who wish to exploit it and allies who demand its secrecy. Second, interacting with the black market ecosystem places them among individuals whose loyalties are transactional, measured only by gold or survival. The apothecaries they meet are not healers. They are chemical artisans of despair. They speak in hushed tones about plant alkaloids found deep within guarded forests, extracted minerals that could induce paranoia mimicking madness, and even techniques involving carefully controlled malnutrition designed to weaken the body's natural defenses over months or years. This education provides a terrible clarity. Political struggle has finally moved beyond mere accusation of disloyalty. It now carries the potential for engineered existence failure. The goal is no longer simply to ruin a reputation, though that remains an art form, but to dismantle the very mechanism of the rival's life force, making them appear incapable of rule or command. Furthermore, the chapter forces the protagonists to grapple with ethics. They are acquiring instruments of devastation. How do you use knowledge designed for ultimate harm? The line between necessary self-defense and becoming a purveyor of deathly craft blurs dangerously thin. Every diagram, every obscure botanical name serves as a heavy moral weight. The process also details the complex mechanics of smuggling these substances into high society undetected. It's not enough simply to possess poison. One must know how to introduce it flawlessly. Is the vial hidden in a seemingly benign spice jar? Is the toxin administered via scented oils that appear to be luxury perfumes, or incorporated into ceremonial wine meant for celebration? The art of administration requires an intimate understanding of the target's routine, their preferred beverage, their daily medicinal draft, the specific moment when they will be least guarded and most relaxed. This pursuit reveals a chilling pattern. The truly devastating weapons are those that appear beneficial or essential. A supposedly exotic restorative tea that carries a slow-acting toxin, a highly potent perfume meant to mask body odor, but which simultaneously introduces paralytic agents into the nasal passages, or even simple, seemingly harmless architectural alterations. A subtle alteration in the ventilation of a chamber that makes certain airborne toxins more effective. The knowledge gathered here equips them not just with deadly means, but with an intellectual understanding of systemic weakness. They learn to see the flaw in the Manor's plumbing system, the vulnerability in the noble's erratic sleep cycle, and the precise window of opportunity afforded by exhaustion or distraction. It is a comprehensive mastery of invisible sabotage. The transition into this forbidden realm necessitates adopting a new persona, a role that demands deep academic knowledge paired with absolute moral detachment. They must become students of darkness, becoming fluent in chemical composition and biological vectors, simply to survive the political machinations ahead. The glamour of the court must now be matched by the terrible utility of hidden science. It is the necessary descent from gossip columns into the alchemist's workshop, armed not just with suspicions, but with deadly formulae to survive in the viper's nest of a medieval court. One must become an expert at becoming invisible. Survival was not predicated on strength or even intelligence. It rested entirely upon artifice. The most dangerous weapon in this world was not the poisoned wine, nor the whispered lie, but the flawless performance of self. By chapter 6, the true nature of threats had been laid bare. Physical decay disguised as natural illness and social ruin administered through meticulously crafted rumor. But these external assaults required an internal fortress, a persona that could withstand constant scrutiny without cracking under pressure. The nobility understood this primal rule. One did not merely exist at court, one performed their existence. This is the realm of deception in dress and demeanor. It was a life lived behind elaborate masks, where every stitch of costly fabric, every measured tilt of the head spoke volumes about your presumed status and underlying intentions. The court became a theater of exquisite performance, and to be caught off script meant certain death. The very clothes one wore were tools of surveillance. Rich velvet announced wealth, but subtly colored dyes might betray foreign influence or banned associations. A hairstyle could signal allegiance, a braid reserved for the king's favor, while an overly ornate circlet suggested a dangerous ambition best kept hidden. Even scent was codified. Certain oils denoted lineage purity, others whispered of forbidden passions. The suspicion that coursed through these halls was never about what you truly were, but rather what they believed you should be. You had to manage the narrative of your own being, constructing an identity so believable and flawless that it became indistinguishable from truth itself. This demanded a level of self-control that bordered on genuine emotional vacancy. The protagonist found herself in this deep dive into necessary artifice. She learned that true vulnerability was her greatest enemy. To navigate the perilous waters of courtly politics, one had to develop a double life, a split persona where the inner truth was ruthlessly buried beneath layers of performance. The goal was not authenticity. The objective was plausible deniability. The required mask had to adapt constantly when interacting with the cynical power brokers in the early hours after midnight. She could project an air of detached brilliance, hinting at knowledge they coveted, but never allowed her to fully display. During a formal daylight reception, the mask shifted instantly. Reserved modesty, wide-eyed admiration for their perceived virtue, and a slight tremor of feigned awe that signaled non-threat status. The most profound deception, however, resided not in the physical disguise or the choice of attire, but deep within the practiced rhythm of her own bearing. It was the way she maintained perfect eye contact long enough to feel invasive, yet brief enough to suggest mutual respect. It was the controlled inflection when accepting a compliment, suggesting grace without conceding true power. It was even the strategic deployment of silence, letting an unanswerable void hang in the air between two crucial statements, forcing others into uncomfortable self-exposure. This forced performance demanded emotional detachment on a devastating scale. She had to observe people, their micro-expressions, when they thought no one was looking, the flicker of envy behind their polite smiles, the nervous repetition of a single word when questioned on matters of loyalty. These observations became her true currency, far more valuable than any jewel worn or title held. She began to suspect that merely appearing innocent was itself the most lethal act. The innocent noble, draped in silks, and carrying an air of delicate ignorance, could be utterly underestimated. Their harmless demeanor served as the perfect cover for deep plotting, allowing them access to secrets others kept locked away by fear or suspicion. The court's greatest deception lay in its collective belief system. That appearance equated to reality. As long as she maintained this facade, the sweet submission of an admired but politically minor figure, she could gather intelligence, observe the weaknesses in the established power structure, and most importantly, survive the constant threat of exposure. The inherent tension was unbearable. Every conversation felt like a scripted exchange, every laugh like a coded warning shot. She realized that her own survival depended on mastering contradiction, appearing completely loyal while collecting damning evidence, seeming utterly powerless while understanding the levers of true authority, presenting herself as harmless when she contained enough poisonous knowledge to dismantle entire families. The performance was not just about avoiding suspicion. It was about redirecting it. When an accusation, whispered or spoken, inevitably landed near her, she trained herself to receive it with a theatrical sadness, the look of the wronged soul, whose greatest failing is merely virtue. This deflective sorrow allowed her allies to pull back accusations without genuinely threatening their own position, making them inadvertently complicit in her protection. The double life was exhausting. It hollowed out the edges of her true self, replacing genuine emotion with highly polished behavioral responses. She walked through opulent halls, burdened by a secret weight, the knowledge of countless lies, and the careful construction required to maintain breathable air around her fabricated peace. This wasn't living. It was continuous character acting in a deadly drama. The art of looking innocent became an advanced military strategy. Never commit to a visible position. Always remain within the periphery of observation. And when cornered, feign confusion rather than confrontation. The court demanded nothing less than absolute psychological mastery, transforming every noble into both player and perpetual suspect in their own fatal drama. The suspicion that had initially fluttered like a moth around the scented candles and spiced bread loaves finally hardened into something far more concrete, something requiring tangible proof. The courtiers, masters of whispered accusation and veiled glances, were accustomed to operating in the misty realm of rumor and perceived slight. They thrived on ambiguity. But the investigation now demanded something harder to wield. Evidence, not just a whisper overheard or a favor suddenly withdrawn, but a physical object bearing the indelible mark of fear. This focus shifted the entire nature of the hunt. The poisons remained invisible, steeped in wine, mixed into expensive oils, even disguised as simple pleasure. But now, forensic attention began to fall upon the vessels and trappings of wealth. The silken sashes, the ornate goblets, The exotic perfumes carried by every passing hand, every exquisite item became a potential crime scene, holding secrets beneath its polished surface or woven into its intricate pattern. The evidence was rarely grand or dramatic. It tended to be minute, almost microscopic, a peculiar residue clinging to the lip of a discarded vial, a faint but unsettling stain on a corner of a velvet tapestry, or an unusual tarnish found upon the silver serving spoons. These fragments of physical reality forced the characters and investigators out of the abstract world of malice and into the demanding discipline of material science. They began treating the luxurious objects not merely as status symbols, but as archival containers of human intent. The patina on a jade cup might reveal traces of an unusual acidic agent, while the weaving pattern of a curtain could harbor foreign threads or substances resistant to mundane cleaning. It was a painstaking process, blending scholarly knowledge with obsessive amateur detection. The concept that haunted them was the fingerprint of fear, the residue left by desperation. A poisoner who knew they were being watched might panic, leaving behind an identifiable slip-up, a mixing mistake, an unfamiliar botanical element, or simply too much evidence. The objects themselves became unreliable narrators, forcing skilled hands to analyze what remained after a crime had been committed. Suddenly, the threat was less about where the poison came from and more about how it was contained and administered. Was the toxin dissolved in the wine, which would stain faintly, or was it affixed to the object, the handle of the goblet, the lip of the drinking chalice, the inner lining of a ceremonial glove, requiring only fleeting contact? This shifted the focus from consumption to proximity. The discovery of specific poisons had already provided dangerous knowledge regarding their preparation and administration. Chapter 6 had armed them with the occult texts and black market recipes for synthetic toxins that mimicked natural illness. Now, they were forced to apply that lethal knowledge back onto the unsuspecting objects of courtly life. They hypothesized methods requiring minimal interaction but maximum effect. A poison designed not just to kill quickly, but to mimic a pre-existing ailment, ensuring suspicion fell upon neglect or poor health rather than outright malice. Investigators grew obsessed with identifying telltale signs on materials that should have been inert. Silk fibers, for example, were examined under powerful lenses, searching for microscopic adherence of oils mixed with exotic alkaloids, the very perfumes used to mask the lethal scents. Linen and damask underwent forensic scrutiny for any unusual discoloration not attributable to age or routine cleaning. The evidence was always faint, requiring a perfect confluence of circumstance. An object handled by multiple hands, left in the proper environment and containing a contaminant subtle enough to be missed, until highly advanced chemical testing revealed its presence. The most chilling conclusion drawn from this physical investigation was that even the act of appearing perfectly clean or perfectly innocuous left traces. The pristine nature of wealth became itself evidence of deceit. To maintain an air of purity, of having never touched anything suspect, of always smelling of natural grace rather than manufactured perfume, required constant effort, and the residue of that deception would inevitably linger somewhere. The court was a museum of luxury, every stain and imperfection telling a story of ambition and betrayal. And now, these objects were not just art, they were criminal exhibits. The realization settled heavily. The deepest conspiracies leave behind physical whispers, a smudge on the marble, an off-kilter thread in the drapery, or the ghost scent on an empty porcelain saucer. These minute details, accumulated meticulously, transformed generalized paranoia into actionable, undeniable proof. It was a sobering understanding that absolute truth lay not in the dramatic confession, but in the careful analysis of what remained when everything else had been swept away by suspicion and time. The final curtain of accusation was always the most terrifying spectacle. It was not a burst of blood or a dramatic confrontation with steel. It was something far quieter, far more pervasive. The measured, suffocating atmosphere of judgment itself. The threads that had been loosely spun across months of whispered meetings and carefully guarded secrets finally converged in one overwhelming tableau. The magnificent hall, typically a place of boisterous display and careless indulgence, felt instead like an immense, exquisitely carved cage. Every polished surface seemed to reflect not just the flickering candelabra light, but the cold, judging scrutiny of every noble present. After all the clandestine visits, the dubious perfumes found on discarded gowns, and the esoteric knowledge painstakingly gathered from black market apothecaries, the protagonists stood poised at the precipice. They had amassed evidence that defied simple classification. A half-empty vial of suspiciously vibrant liquid, a fragmented piece of silk bearing an unknown residue, a pattern of sudden illnesses affecting only those closest to their rivals. They knew they could not win a trial by law because the law was too blunt and visible. The court operated on currents far more delicate than judicial decree. It functioned entirely on consensus, on belief, and on the fragile architecture of shared social understanding. To be found guilty here required only enough doubt to achieve fatal certainty. The truth arrived not as a grand confession, but as an accumulation of circumstantial moments, each one adding weight until the cumulative burden crushed the accused. The presentation unfolded in measured segments, almost ritualistically, designed to build paranoia through intellectual exhaustion. First, the whispers were formalized, not simply rumors, but narratives, carefully constructed accounts of disloyalty, woven into seemingly mundane observations. The accusers spoke with a veneer of deep concern, portraying themselves not as enemies, but as concerned guardians of the realm's delicate stability. They painted a portrait of suspicion, that the accused harbored secrets, that their apparent innocence was merely a masterful performance designed to mask treacherous ambition. Then came the material evidence placed out before them, like damning artifacts on a museum plinth dedicated to malfeasance. The residue from the tapestries, showing an uncommon blend of foreign dyes and oils. The pattern in the drinking goblets, suggesting specialized preparation meant for discreet consumption. These objects were transformed, under intense scrutiny, from mere accoutrements into instruments of conspiracy. The protagonist's brilliance lay in their ability to manage this confluence of evidence. They had seen how rumor could dismantle a reputation, and how residue could prove poison. But the true mastery was realizing that they needed to weave these threads together, creating an inescapable tapestry of implied guilt. When all was laid bare, the court did not gasp in shock. It murmured with a chilling, almost disappointed sigh. They had been given enough compelling ambiguities to satisfy their deepest aristocratic suspicions. The accusations peaked during a staged moment of reckoning, a formal reading aloud of correspondences and questionable ledgers. Everything pointed toward complicity. Secret meetings in poorly lit chambers, unexplained foreign sympathies, and the continuous network of favors traded with invisible hands. The weight was unbearable. The accused faced not only the evidence, but the collective, unspoken agreement of the nobility to believe that suspicion, that gnawing uncertainty about who among them might be poison, was far more potent than any physical toxin. And so, the climax arrived not with a jail cell or a public hanging, but with profound and agonizing humiliation. The verdict was passed by silence, by gazes, by averted eyes, and by the systematic erasure of all prior favor. They were found utterly suspect, guilty of a failing that could never be written down, the failure to remain flawlessly untainted. The unmasking ritual completed itself when the court offered no execution, but something far worse, exile. To be socially excised was, in this world, death by gradual starvation of influence. It meant losing the right to feast at these tables, the inability to attend the great celebrations, and the systematic dismantling of every relationship that provided oxygen to one's status. The realization settled over them like a shroud, that their greatest survival mechanism, the double life, the facade of perfect innocence, had been exposed. They had mastered the art of deception in public, only to find themselves undone by the very standards of flawless performance they sought to uphold. They stood amongst the assembled highborn, utterly visible, yet profoundly invisible. Their name was spoken with a distaste that masked its power, reducing decades of ambition and love to a single scathing indictment. They were not merely banished, they were rendered morally unbelievable. To speak their name now would be to risk being stained by association. The truth, therefore, served cold. It was not fire or blood, but the chilling certainty that there was no future in polite society for them here. The greatest poison had been the loss of perceived worth, a venom brewed slowly from accusation and consensus, undetectable until its devastating conclusion. They survived, perhaps, but they certainly did not reign. The curtain falls on the grand spectacle of the court. The silence that follows is not relief. It is something far more brittle, more dangerous than any shouted accusation. The immediate threat has receded, but the air remains thick with the residue of paranoia, a lingering musk of fear and expensive perfume. To survive this ordeal was not to win a clean victory, but merely to be deemed tolerable, salvageable enough not to be discarded entirely. The truth, as always in the gilded cage of courtly life, proved itself an imperfect solvent. It did not burn away the lies or cleanse the blood. Rather, it simply revealed the depth and resilience of the venoms that had already been absorbed into the very structure of society. We are left standing in the wreckage, amidst silks torn by suspicion and reputations shattered like delicate porcelain. The journey through the whispers, the suspicious spies, the tainted goblet, and the careful assessment of every failing body has taught us a singular, painful lesson: that survival here is not about righteousness. It is about an acute, almost pathological mastery of contradiction. One must convince others not merely that they are safe, but that their very presence is innocuous. Consider what we have witnessed: the poisoning disguised as malady, the accusation wrapped in polite conversation, and the devastating banishment formalized by a lack of signature on a favor. These were not dramatic acts of villainy. They were the quiet consequences of living under constant scrutiny, where every breath was weighed against perceived disloyalty. The wounds inflicted here are not merely physical or legal. They are deeply sociological. Even if we exit this court alive, branded by suspicion, but unexecuted, the stain remains indelible. Trust is a commodity far more volatile and perishable than any metal mined in the royal treasury. It can be minted quickly during celebration and vaporized instantly by a single misplaced word. The survivors, those who walk away from this gilded ruin, carry an internal exile. They are forever looking over their shoulders, hyper-aware of the peripheral whispers, the slight shift in body language across the great hall. They have learned that the most effective weapons are not the arsenic or the poisoned rapier, but a carefully timed sigh, a glance shared with a mutual enemy, or the suggestion of knowledge held too closely. The concept of cleansing through truth dissolved here. Instead, we found that power was maintained by sustaining ambiguity. It is safer to remain exquisitely unreliable than outright condemned. The ideal courtier does not prove their innocence. They embody a plausible degree of necessary imperfection, just enough suspicious eccentricity to be intriguing, but never so unsettling as to provoke true malice. I have spent my life observing these cycles, cataloging the fatal beauty of aristocratic paranoia. We assumed that by gathering evidence, the subtle stain on the tapestry, the unusual perfume residue, the contradictory diagnoses, that we could construct an undeniable case for truth. Yet, even when every piece fits into place, pointing fingers at a visible enemy, the human element remains untamable. Suspicion itself becomes a self-sustaining parasite. It demands constant feeding. It thrives on perceived weakness, forgotten slights, and the simple, exhausting act of living in proximity to ambition. The court does not simply judge, it metabolizes fear, and that fear sustains the entire elaborate ecosystem. The bitter end, then, is this acceptance. There is no absolute victory here, only a pause. We have merely traded one kind of danger for another, the visible threat of execution, replaced by the invisible, gnawing dread of perpetual doubt. Or perhaps, survival itself becomes the most profound poison. To retain your station means accepting that you are permanently marked, capable of immense artistry in deception, and thus always capable of fatal error. We have traded our peace for temporary favor, exchanging open battle for a state of suspended animation, where every meal is still watched with hawk-like suspicion, and every moment requires the elaborate performance of perfect indifference. The curtain does not rise on a clear day. It merely shifts to reveal dawn viewed through layers of smoked glass. The light is beautiful, but utterly deceptive. We leave this chapter having understood that some wounds never truly close. They simply become structural elements of the self, the permanent scaffolding of suspicion and careful performance. The vigilance remains absolute. The venoms remain coursing through the veins of power, even when the feast has cleared.